Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace? Unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. So, I've mentioned this in the past. I would consider myself to be someone who is very disciplined, and someone who's very much of routine and very much of pattern. But I actually don't like commitments. I got commitment issues. I feel like it's an obligation at one point, and I feel like, once I say I'm doing something, I just feel stuck. I kind of like this thing of, if someone invites me to something and I'll just say maybe, but because of that, plans don't happen with me that as much as I would like them to have. But yeah, I have commitment issues. God, I can't believe I actually do, but we'll get into that. And for me, when I make a commitment to something, and especially for example, if it's a commitment even to just a social function, I end up dreading the occasion. Now, this could also be mixing with the fact that I don't like to talk that much. When it comes to these social settings, because it's just a lot of also external stimulus. But yeah, I end up really dreading it, and I end up regretting having said yes to something. And another part about commitments I really don't like is that people then have expectations of you, and I'm someone who I would say is a people pleaser, so I really do want to meet those expectations. At the same time, I'm tired, and I don't even know if I have the capacity at that moment. Yeah, and because I also think that I have usually a long ongoing to-do list. When I make another commitment to something or have another obligation, it just feels like another thing that's on my to-do list. And I don't even care if it's beneficial for me. It just irks me, genuinely. And I just want to be what the fuck did I actually say yes to this shit? So let's get into today's episode. And we're going to talk about commitment issues, if you haven't guessed it already. I'm not going to say commitment issues are necessarily so normal, because there's definitely different reasons as to why people have them. But I think, nowadays, especially in relationships, people we get into these situationships, and it is becoming a bit too normalized, I would say, even for my own standard, for my own standard, because I don't want to say for anyone else. But yeah, let's get into commitment issues, what they actually are. Commitment issues means avoiding making plans, avoiding the future, and can often have a lot to do with the fact that you might have trust issues. It has a lot to do with being afraid, and especially being afraid of the unknown, because you have to think about it. Even if you're making a plan just to go somewhere with someone, right? That plan hasn't happened yet. Yeah, you might have had other plans in the past that are similar to this, but you don't know how this one is going to end up. And especially when it gets to commitment issues, being in relationships, even if you've never been in a relationship before, you have never been in a relationship with this person before. So you don't know, exactly how that is going to go. And it is that big thing of the fear of the unknown. And also the fear of sometimes just being stuck. Because once you say yes to something, I think that's also why I'm starting to become very afraid of marriage, the concept of marriage. Because I'm what? Oh my gosh, that's your entire life. Okay, let's not get into my personal issues right now. But it is this thing of, okay, now I have to, hold this out. And, whether or not you have the discipline for that is one thing, but whether or not you're even excited to be there is another thing. Also, when it comes to commitments, usually there's also responsibilities attached to it. And sometimes we just don't want the responsibilities of that. Sometimes we just can't handle that. Also leading to commitment issues. And, I said that you might even feel stuck when you have these commitment issues, but sometimes you can also feel like you're missing out on things, and you could actually even develop FOMO, fear of missing out, from just having commitment issues, because you're afraid that if you commit to something, then you're going to miss out on other opportunities. And that's why you want to keep your options kind of wide open, like myself, where I'm the type of person who will say maybe to some plan, but I know that if a better plan comes up, in some cases, I think, yeah, no, I know in some cases I've been someone who has literally use the excuse that I haven't said yes to these plans exactly. And I've gone to the other plan that seemed better at that moment because I didn't want to miss out on this one. Yeah, I have commitment issues. Oh my gosh. So that's basically what commitment issues are. Again, I don't think they're normal in every single sense. Like, I wouldn't say it's something that should be normalized, but it is becoming, I think, especially with our generation, if you're Gen Z, it is becoming very normalized in many different aspects of your life, but especially like in relationships. So let's get a bit more with me. And why do I have commitment issues with specific different things? So I have commitment issues with extracurriculars now and anything besides school, because last year I overcommitted myself to many different plans. I'm the type of person who all throughout even middle school, high school, uni, has been someone who was, the president of this, the club founder of this, partaking in all of these events and things. And it just led me to burn out. And so I know that my commitment issues when it comes to even like signing up to do something, it really just stems from the fact that like I've seen myself overcommit to things in the past. And I've seen how like, I couldn't handle the responsibilities of things. I couldn't handle the pressures. And I just started dreading and like ended up feeling stuck in most of these positions last year. So like now, honestly, I look at my life and I'm like, bro, like I have barely any commitments or barely anything even that I'm leading. And I know it's not because like I'm not capable, but just because I've seen myself last year. And, to a degree, it's kind of good that I took a break. But it's also this thing of like, I can feel like when someone's saying like, hey, you're going to join this club or something like this, or you're going to be part of, help us like clean up with some event. I'm like, oh, not really. Like, no, I really start to get really hesitant with it, even though I'm not the type of person who usually does that. Another aspect of my commitment issues also relates to relationships. I unfortunately was stuck in a 1-year situationship for many different reasons. Thank God that didn't work out. But I had become so used to being in this in-between, and I was so familiar with that type of chaos. Like, I felt like that was it, And the idea of actually getting into a relationship now scares the actual living shit out of me. Like, I see some of my friends do that shit, and I'm like, what? That's insane. Good for you guys, And I think also because of that experience, for many different reasons as well, like I ended up putting like what it meant to be in a relationship on a pedestal and making it seem like it was so hard to obtain and it's such a difficult thing, which it is. But yeah, that entire experience also left me having commitment issues, like even with relationships, which is really different from like who I was before that, because I used to be someone who was always like, I'm ready to sacrifice for this relationship. I'm ready to do this and that. And now I'm like, guys, relax. I don't need that. But yeah, that's partially like where my commitment issues are stemming from. But overall, let's talk about why do we have commitment issues? I've mentioned this in terms of like what are commitment issues, and it's because we are afraid. We are afraid. I think for many of us who are especially people who are tackling things head on, that's something that's very hard to admit. But like, I look at my CV now and I'm like, I don't know how I did all those things, because like I am now afraid of committing to even helping with a cleanup for like a group activity or something like this. I'm afraid of that. Yeah. It's a lot has to do with fear. As I mentioned, also like fear of the unknown. Sometimes also like fear of not having control of what's going to happen in that situation as well. We also, like I've just mentioned, we could have had bad experiences with commitments in the past, or what should have potentially been commitments in the past. So that might also impact, like, whether or not we're willing to do that in the future. This could be also result in, like, traumatic experiences, leaving you with, like, commitment issues being your trauma response to that. And in that situation, go ahead, find a therapist, and with that, you read into how we can, deal with commitment issues. I'll talk about that, but I would, in those cases, especially when it comes to very triggering matters, and I think in most cases, keep saying most cases, but in many situations, it has to do with, like, being in those relationships, sometimes even being in those friendships, where it does leave you like, hey, I don't really want to commit to this, then finding a therapist, talking it out in those manners, or finding other coping strategies if the ones that I'm going to mention don't help. Now, other reasons that we could potentially have commitment issues: lack of trust. We might also be have fear of being rejected by people when we get too close to them. Has a lot to do with avoidant attachment issues. I've talked about that many times in these episodes, but I'll continue to mention them. Then some of us also have commitment issues, specifically looking in relationships, because we have such a desire for independence. And some of us have also the, like, not too much independence, but, like, we're hyper independent. So we don't understand even what that looks like to be committed to someone else. And we might interpret, like, what commitment means in a very negative light. So that could also impact why we maybe not would want a commitment. And then there's also potentially having doubt within the stability of those relationships. And those relationships don't just have to be, relationships, but even I was saying, like, with, like, these groups and these extracurriculars, doubting whether or not it's going to be stable, and how much that could also impact you, because all the relationships that you're in, every single group, it is going to have a certain impact on your life, especially if you're not able to, I guess, compartmentalize them in a correct way. But even if you are able to, it's still going to impact your life. Like, there's no way getting around that. So sometimes we don't want to commit to things where we don't know if it's going to be stable or not. All normal, but let's, again, let's not try to normalize these commitment issues too much, because a lot of life does require us saying, hey, yes, I'm going to be there. Yes, I'm going to show up. Even when it's tough. This isn't just for relationships. This is for many different things in life. But it does, as we move forward, as we gain more responsibilities, as we become more mature, it's part of it. So how do we get over this? How do we overcome this, or at least make ourselves aware about our own commitment issues, because we wouldn't want to actually be hurting other people because we're not aware of the fact that we're afraid. The first thing that, this is why I've kept on saying, like, I'm afraid, is literally admitting to ourselves that we are afraid of certain things. And again, I think that's especially hard if you're someone who likes to tackle things head on. And now you have to admit to yourself, like, hey, I actually can't do this right now. Hey, I don't have it within me. And when this comes into consideration with other people, whether that be in friendships, relationships, or even, like, work-related or extracurricular-related, or just being able to show up for people, it's very important that you have open communication with them, and that you're very honest with other people about where you're even able to, like, are you even able to meet them at that level? Are you even able to show up and be at every single meeting, for instance? It's also really important that you take a moment and assess your behaviors and your triggers, especially when it comes to commitments. And, I'm talking specifically now of people who have that avoidant attachment with, like, the fear of being rejected, but also just, like, understanding, like, oh, like, when things get too much and when it's starting to seem like, oh, this is actually serious and stuff, what's happening to me at that moment? Like, what's going on at that space, because then you'll be able to inform yourself about that, like that that at this moment, that's when it's just going to be like, oh, you're just going to want to run away from the commitment, the obligation, all the responsibilities. You're just going to want to run away from that moment. So it's important to understand that trigger and what it is. And also, again, if this is within a relationship with other people, this is not something that you just handle with yourself. This is also something that you are explaining to other person, because, I don't want to say this because I don't mean this in every situation, but you do owe people something. You do owe them an explanation in some regards as to why certain things are just too difficult for you to handle. Not because you're trying to over-explain yourself or be apologetic necessarily, but so that it's very, I don't know, you're clear and you're honest about it. At least I think that's just my opinion on it. Like, you don't have to necessarily have that or agree with me on that. But yeah, being able to understand what your triggers are, explain them to other people, so perhaps that they've also kind of, it's not that you use that as an excuse either. It's just so that you can tackle that at the same time. It could even be this thing of, in a non-relationship setting. So, when it comes to having all these meetings for a certain event, telling the person like, hey, when it comes to this time, or like when there's lots of things going on in my life, I may not be able to show up as much. Like, is that okay for you? And like having that clear communication, that open honesty, and it kind of in a not passive way, but in a vague way, stating this is my trigger. Like, when the situations get a bit tough, like I don't know if I'll be able to handle that. Being honest about that. And another way that we can kind of get through these commitment issues and start to have positive associations with commitments is, I would say, like exposing yourself to positive commitments, like even if they're very short. So it could be literally something like your friend asks you, like, hey, can you help me with this? And it's like within a day, or not in a day, within 2 days or something like this, like some occasion is happening. Can you be there for that person? And you know what? In most cases, like, this is personal experience, but like all those spontaneous decisions I've made where it comes to like helping out another person, I've had so much fun with them, actually. I've had so much fun with them. And I don't know, it kind of makes me feel like, this is actually not so bad. And for someone who used to be like overly committed to things, it's really helped, I don't know, like navigating back into not that exact headspace, but just seeing that, like saying yes to these things and, having that responsibility, it's not that bad. You're not always going to have the worst case scenarios. It's not that bad. So having that short positive exposure, that might even help you, because the more you collect those experiences, the more you might be able to say like, hey, you know what? I might already have the discipline for something, but now I can actually even say like, yes, let's do this. Even knowing that it might not turn out the best way. And that's another thing. Look at your discipline with it. If that might be the thing that's like really impacting, that you don't know if you're able to like actually be there for it constantly, look at your discipline with that. And we can talk about that in another episode. So don't worry. Because I know I've said that like my discipline comes a lot from like the way I was raised when I was younger. But we'll talk about how we can even gain it now in our 20s. And one thing that I want to say, I keep saying that like, hey, it's let's not normalize commitment issues, but I do want to say it's okay to have commitment issues. It's okay to say that you are not ready for commitment. What's not okay, and this is how I said, like, clear and open communication. What's not okay is for you to lead someone on, or to, I guess, tell someone you're going to be there and not be able to be there, because you kind of just leave like a sour taste in their mouth, like of you, like it's just, it might be a bad representation of you. And yeah, sometimes it's just this thing of like, hey, we don't know ourselves enough right now. We don't know where we are at right now. Because maybe in the past, like I said with myself, like you were someone who's great at commitment, and now you're just not someone who's like that anymore. And that's completely okay. Like, we're constantly changing. But all in all, it's like, it's okay to have commitment issues. It's just, being aware of how we move around with them, because we don't want to hurt other people. And we also don't want to say to a fucking party committee that like we can be there when we actually can't be there. Because, oh my gosh. Or like for a presentation, you can't be there. It's okay. Just don't tell me that you can be there if you can't, just so having that clear, open communication. But it's okay to have commitment issues overall. So now going back to me, and my personal experience, and I think, specifically looking at those two aspects that I've mentioned where I have commitment issues, now that I guess I've not healed, I don't know, I still don't commit to many things now. But one thing that I do, like now when it even comes to extracurriculars or trying to get back into it, is I ask myself, hey, do I have the capacity? And I try not to look at other people and what they're doing. Like I've got friends who work 2 jobs, like go to school full time and are running multiple clubs. And I'm like, girl, what? I do not have the energy for that. And it is this basic thing of asking myself, like, without taking into consideration what other people are doing, not comparing myself, like, hey, do I have it within me? And would this be too much of a commitment for me at this time? And not judging myself, when I say no, like it's not going to be the good time for it. And yeah, that's kind of how I've gotten back into it. Like now, okay, I'm not, because now the past 2 weekends, but I joined like netball at my school. And that's something that, I don't know, it's been like I wouldn't say a short exposure of a positive commitment, but it has been a positive commitment because it's fun and it's not something where I feel like I'm being drained. Yes, it is commitment and obligation to go there, but I don't know, it's nice doing something for once where it's just like, whew, I don't know, where I don't feel like I'm dreading it. And another commitment that I've made, not recently, but I think like 2 months ago, was committing to my job. And obviously there's a nice paycheck for it. But what I mean by that is like I asked myself like, hey, do I have the capacity to actually like do my job? And that's another reason like why I don't do as many extracurriculars now, is because I made that one of my priorities. Like I made sure like I was going to be able to commute, because I commute 1.5 hours, like not even, I commute 2 hours every, like 2 and from 3 days a week. Was I going to be able to do that? And I had to ask myself that, like, and that's another thing, like, hey, am I putting boundaries, like even on like, am I just being able to say no? Am I putting boundaries on myself, like, and understanding like how much I can actually do in one go, and not burning myself out, because that really was my fear. Yeah. And then going back to the entire situation of like, being in a situationship, how do I navigate getting through that? Honestly, I don't touch that subject at all right now. But I do know that if someone were to come up to me right now, I would definitely just say like, hey, I'm not like looking for a relationship. And I'm also probably not looking for I'm not looking for anything at this moment in time. Like, and just being very upfront and clear with, like, not clear, but being very upfront with them and being very clear about like, hey, where I stand, so that they're not like, wasting their time. Because what's the point right now, like, if I'm unavailable, So yeah, I wouldn't say I've gotten through commitment issues. Especially like, with the but with the last one that I just talked about, like, it's a lot of like work on myself. So like, hey, why am I afraid? Like going back into many different areas. But I would say that I'm doing okay. I would say that I'm trying. And that's all you really can do with these moments. So yeah, those are commitment issues on my end. Now let's get back to you and your reflection for this week. So the first thing I want you guys to ask yourself is, do you want to commit to things and to people? Do you even want to do that? Like, because if you don't want to, then, doing the work for it might not necessarily be for you at this moment. And that's okay. That's okay to have commitment issues, but Do you want to commit? Ask yourself that. And then something that you should reflect on is, are you pacing yourself like as you go into these commitments? So are you someone who's taking them all at once and then all of a sudden you just realize you can't handle it and just drop it? Or are you someone who's like, okay, step by step, I'm going to take on this. Okay, see how we're doing? We're doing okay. We're doing okay. We had a little blip, but we're doing okay. And I'm going to take on this. Because when you pace yourself out, it's also like, it's just, you're gaining these types of obligations, you're gaining these commitments, and you might even like, hopefully you're seeing them in a positive light, but it's hopefully also not just draining you, like, because when you just take them all at once because you think you're completely 100% ready, like, you just might get really scared about it. And that's really normal and that's okay, especially if you come from like traumatic situations. But just ask yourself, hey, do you want commitment? And hey, how are you actually pacing yourself out when it comes to committing to these things? Because you don't want to overdo it with yourself. Also know where you are at. Be very, very mindful. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you guys take the time to reflect this week. Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting this week's episode of The Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go check out our TikTok and Instagram for more content.